And it aligns pretty seamlessly with the broader standards set by organizations like AAOIFI, that's the Accounting and Auditing Organization for Islamic Financial Institutions. So our mission today is really to demystify this pooled finance. We want to understand precisely how it operates under Sharia principles and maybe most importantly, uncover the key do's and don'ts for the institutions involved. Okay, let's unpack this. So let's start right at the beginning. What exactly is consolidated banking finance? At its heart, it seems to be a collaborative venture. You've got a group of financial institutions, they join forces for joint financing, but, and this is the crucial bit, they only use investment formulas that are explicitly legitimate under Islamic law. And a core requirement I see here is that the accounts for these pooled funds have to be totally separate from the individual institution's own books. Why is that separation so vital right from the get-go?
Yeah, that independence is absolutely foundational. You can't overstate it. And what's fascinating here, actually, is how broad the scope of this standard really is. I mean, it doesn't just cover operations between Islamic financial institutions themselves. It also clearly addresses how Islamic institutions can interact with conventional banks within these pooled structures.
Yeah.
And naturally, it defines the relationships between this whole group of institutions and the clients they're financing. So it's really about creating a clear framework for, well, every possible interaction.
Okay, I see. So if the accounts are separate and the scope is wide, then the actual subject of consolidated banking finance must be incredibly precise. My understanding is the activities being financed must be legitimate investment activities. But what does legitimate really mean here in practice?
Precisely. And this really highlights the ethical backbone of Islamic finance, doesn't it? The standard is very, very clear on what's prohibited. The finance cannot involve any activities or services forbidden by Sharia, not even partially. And critically, it absolutely cannot, under any circumstances, be based on usurious, that's interest-based financing, not in whole or in part. So for projects, say, involve gambling, or maybe part of it relied on a conventional interest-bearing loan, it would immediately be outside the permissible scope. Doesn't matter how beneficial it might seem otherwise. That commitment to principle guides everything.
Right. That's a very clear line. So with those ethical boundaries firmly in place, how do institutions actually, structure the financing to ensure compliance, especially on these large-scale projects? What are the practical tools they use? The source material gives some incredibly specific examples, quite diverse, really, of these permissible forms of granting finance to clients. We see classic sale-based structures like murabaha, that's the cost-plus sale, or musawama, which is more of a bargaining sale. These were often used for procuring specific assets, maybe on deferred or installment terms. But the toolkit is, well, it's much richer than that. You've also got leasing models like Ijara, a straightforward lease, or Ijara Muntahiya Bidamlik, that's the lease that ends with ownership. Very flexible for different kinds of assets. And then there are forward contracts, things like salam, a forward sale, and parallel salam, or istisna, which is a manufacturing contract, and parallel istisna. These seem incredibly powerful for funding, say, infrastructure projects right from the start. And then you get into the partnership and profit-sharing models, like mudaraba, where one side brings capital, the other expertise. Profit-sharing, but the capital provider bears the monetary loss. Or musharaka, which is a true joint venture. All parties put in capital share profits and losses proportionally. These can even be fixed or diminishing variations. Plus, there are these specialized agricultural partnerships, Muzara, Musakat, and Mukarasa, for tree planting, and of course, investment sukuk, Islamic bonds. Now, for these big multi-institution projects, why are those partnership models like musharaka particularly significant? How do they fundamentally shift the risk profile compared to just, standard debt financing?
That's a crucial distinction, yeah. The partnership models, especially musharaka and mudaraba, are so significant because they inherently embody risk sharing. That's the core idea. Instead of aiming for a guaranteed return like you'd get in interest-based finance, the participants actually share in the real profits and losses of the venture. This naturally promotes, well, greater due diligence, a deeper commitment from everyone involved to make sure the project succeeds. It means the institutions are truly invested in the project, not just lending money and waiting for repayment. Now, a common query that comes up is about the participation of Islamic institutions with traditional banks. While the principle, often starts with Islamic institutions collaborating among themselves, the standard explicitly states there's no Sharia impediment for traditional banks to join in. However, and this is the vital caveat, the operations themselves must strictly adhere to legitimate Islamic formulas. That ensures consistency in the principles, even with varied participants involved. And building on that point regarding leadership within these consolidated finances,
well, ideally, you'd see an Islamic institution taking the lead. A conventional bank can actually lead if
And it's a big if. All the contracts, all the activities, and all the financing types involved are entirely Sharia compliant. This flexibility, I think, is really key to integrating Islamic finance within the broader financial landscape. It shows its adaptability, but without compromising its core principles. It's about the substance, not just the label on the door.
That flexibility in leadership is fascinating. But okay, for a system built on such strict principles, how is that compliance truly ensured across multiple entities? Especially if a traditional bank might be at the helm. This must bring us to the Sharia supervision requirement, right? The standard seems very clear. The organization, the execution, the ongoing monitoring of this pooled finance must be supervised by the Sharia boards of all the institutions involved. And there's even a strong preference mentioned for forming a joint committee of these Sharia boards. And crucially, their decisions are binding. Practically speaking, though, what's the biggest challenge when you get multiple Sharia boards, maybe from different institutions with slightly different leanings, trying to form a joint committee and make binding decisions on some complex multi-million-dollar project?
That's a vital question, absolutely. The main challenge often lies in harmonizing different interpretations or perhaps preferences that might exist among various Sharia boards, even when they're operating within the same broad principles. It requires really robust communication, clear protocols for handling disagreements, and fundamentally a deep shared understanding of the common underlying standards, like those from AAOIFFI. It's about reaching consensus while rigorously upholding those fundamental Sharia principles. And this emphasis on joint Sharia oversight also connects neatly to the concept of mixed funding. It is permissible to fund, say, part of a single project using Islamic finance, while another part uses traditional methods. However, and this is critical, this is only allowed if there's absolute impermeable separation in the accounts and the management between the two types of financing. This clear line ensures the integrity of the Sharia-compliant portion. It keeps its distinct identity and avoids any risk of, well, mixing in the forbidden elements.
Okay, that makes sense. So once the partnerships are defined and the principles established, what about the actual mechanics? How do these relationships function day to day? The standard outlines several permissible methods for the relationship between parties in these deals. In a mudaraba structure, for instance, the lead institution acts as the mudarib, the fund manager. They have sole management responsibility. What's particularly interesting here is that the mudarib is allowed to mix its own funds with the mudaraba funds. What's the thinking behind allowing the mudarib to combine its own money? What does that imply?
Well, it speaks directly to the mudarib's vested interest in the project. By allowing them to co-invest their own funds, it strongly aligns their incentives with the overall success of the pooled funds. It emphasizes that shared risk and shared reward we talked about. Then you have musharaka. This is more of a true partnership structure where institutions collectively provide the finance. Now, losses here are borne proportionally to their capital contribution. That's straightforward. But profits can be distributed according to prior agreement, which might not be proportional to capital. There's flexibility in management, too. They can use a joint management committee, or they can delegate management to just one institution. If one institution takes on that management role, it might receive an increased profit share for that extra work, or perhaps a fixed fee. But crucially, this requires a separate management contract, distinct from the main partnership agreement. This separation ensures the management fee is clearly for services rendered, not some kind of disguised interest payment.
Right, that separation seems key again. And finally, there's agency, or wakala. This can be wakala for a known fee, which needs its own separate independent contract spelling out the work and time frame. The agent gets that fee whether the project makes a profit or not, and could even get an incentive bonus. Or alternatively, there's wakala without fee, where the managing institution basically does the work without specific compensation for that role. So quite a bit of flexibility there for managing the collective effort. Let's shift gears slightly to the initial groundwork. Who pays for things like the feasibility studies, the legal structuring? How are those early efforts compensated? The standard addresses this under preparatory work and commissions. It seems to allow the lead institution to receive a commission for this initial heavy lifting. Covers things like feasibility studies, organizing the whole operation, gathering the participants, drafting the contracts.
Exactly. And the basis for this compensation is quite flexible. It can be set at cost, less than cost, or even more than cost, depending on the agreement. And this applies whether that lead institution eventually gets entrusted with the ongoing management or not. What's absolutely forbidden, though, is receiving what's called a linkage commission. That's a no-go, because such a commission might imply a sort of guaranteed return or a fee just for making introductions, which kind of skirts around the core principles of shared risk and rewarding actual effort or value added.
Okay, no linkage commissions. So given these different management structures, Mudari, Musher, agent, and What about the role and guarantee of the managing bank? The standard is very clear here. The managing party, regardless of the structure, operates as a trustee or amana. What does that trustee role fundamentally imply for their responsibilities?
It implies a duty of care, a duty of diligence. They have to act responsibly and prudently with the funds. But crucially, it's not a guarantee of the outcome. And this leads directly into the forbidden guarantees section, which is really critical for understanding how risk is allocated in Islamic finance. The manager, whether under a mudaraba or a musharaka structure, is explicitly not allowed to guarantee the debtors for the partners. They can't promise the partners they'll cover any defaults, nor can they guarantee against currency exchange rate fluctuations. This powerfully reinforces that principle of shared risk. The participants, the partners, must bear the genuine commercial risks of the venture. It really means institutions have to conduct rigorous due diligence right from the start, knowing there isn't a safety net provided by the manager for these specific types of risk.
That makes a lot of sense, really emphasizes the true partnership aspect. And speaking of currency, let's touch on exchange rates. The standard requires that a specific currency for the finance has to be determined up front. Okay. However, participating institutions can contribute their funds in different currencies, but those funds have to be converted to the designated finance currency at the prevailing exchange rate on the day they contribute. Similarly, when profits or other financial rights are distributed, institutions can receive them in a different currency, again, at the prevailing exchange rate on the day of distribution. But just to hammer that point home about guarantees again, no party can commit to protecting another from the risks of currency exchange rate fluctuations. What kind of challenges does this no guarantee rule around exchange rates create for, say, long-term international projects funded this way?
Well, it places the burden of managing that currency risk squarely on the shoulders of the participating institutions themselves. The managing party can't just absorb it or promise it away. So this really encourages the use of Sharia-compliant hedging instruments, where available and appropriate, or perhaps very careful structuring of the underlying asset sales or contracts to naturally mitigate that exposure, rather than relying on a forbidden guarantee. And finally, let's look at exit, or disengagement in pooled banking finance. How do participants get out if they need to? The standard outlines clear, permissible, and forbidden options here. It's permissible for parties to agree upfront on closed operations, meaning basically no one exits until the whole operation is liquidated and wound up. Alternatively, an exit before liquidation is also permissible. This could be to an external third party or selling a stake to an existing partner. This has to be based on the contractual terms and, crucially, at a value agreed upon at the time of exit, reflecting the current market value or assessed value then. Now, there's a nuance. This type of exit is generally allowed if the cash and debts within the pool are sort of incidental compared to the main assets and financial rights. If cash and debt dominate, then specific Sharia rules for currency exchange and debt dealing apply, mainly to prevent anything that looks like disguised interest. However, there are two very clear forbidden options for exit. Any prior agreement allowing a partner to exit at the nominal value of their contribution, that's not allowed. Nor is any prior agreement that guarantees a specific profit margin upon exit. These are forbidden. And it's crucial because such guarantees would completely negate the principle of risk sharing that's so central to Islamic finance. It could effectively turn what looks like a partnership into a disguised interest-bearing loan. The exit has to reflect the true performance and value at that specific moment.
Wow, what an intricate and, well, carefully balanced system. It really brings home how Islamic finance, even when dealing with these large-scale, multi-party pooled operations, rigorously maintains its core principles. Ethical investment, risk sharing, avoiding interest. The standard seems to ensure that compliance while still allowing for the complex collaborative financial structures that are just necessary in the modern world.
Absolutely. And stepping back for just a moment, I think understanding these specific rules really gives you a profound insight into how Islamic financial principles are applied in very practical modern banking scenarios. It's all about having robust ethical frameworks guiding these complex transactions, aiming for stability and fairness through ultimately shared accountability.
It really is. So, thinking bigger picture, what does all this mean for the future of global finance? And, how might these principles, this focus on risk sharing and ethical screening, how might they influence other financial systems, perhaps those grappling with issues of stability or seeking more ethical investment pathways? Something for all of us to consider, perhaps. The broader implications of such detailed Sharia compliance in our increasingly interconnected financial landscape.